We left off talking about Marx and Engels' theory of globalization. Now, of course, they do not use this term, globalization. That's a 20th century term. But if you look at what they're saying about capitalism, they are proposing that capitalism is one of the main drivers of globalization, what we now call this kind of global interconnectedness between all nations, all economies, all corporations and cultures and peoples and so forth. Just global interconnectedness. That's basically Marx and Engels' notion of globalization. They think that the bourgeoisie is one of the primary agents of this globalization, and they think the bourgeoisie is going to use the nation state to create large European empires. These empires are going to draw non-capitalist countries, countries that have not yet industrialized, into a capitalist global system. To use Marx and Engels' language, the bourgeoisie is going to compel all non-capitalist economies to join the world market. Look on page 213 of the Prometheus edition of Marx and Engels. That's the pink edition that I've assigned for this class. And you'll see Marx and Engels' take on this. Okay, so this is the Manifesto of the Communist Party, where they say, the bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian, nations into civilization. You'll notice here, they don't use scare quotes around these terms like barbarian and civilization. Okay, so there was actually very common usage in European languages and European cultures. There are very common usages of this term barbarian. It was meant to mark cultures and countries that the Europeans felt were behind. Well, how are they behind? For Marx and Engels, you can already see that their notion of ahead and behind has to do with technology and economy. So, for example, they say rapid improvements of all instruments of production. That's one of the things that makes the bourgeoisie of Europe ahead. And then they also say immensely facilitated means of communication. Okay, so at the time, this would have been like telegraph technology. And they don't mention it, but they would also say things like immensely facilitated means of transportation. So one of the things that European industrialists were doing, including in non-European countries, including in colonies that they took over, was building railroads. Why? So they could ship raw materials, so they could ship finished goods, so they can ship laborers around the colony. Okay, so this notion of barbarian, this notion of less developed, you've got to give it a primarily economic meaning for Marx and Engels. Okay, they continue. I'm on 213 still. The cheap prices of the bourgeoisie commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. What Marx and Engels here are referring to are a number of conflicts between the British Empire. Remember, we took a look at that Wikimedia, where the British Empire had its hands in economies all over the world, stretching from the Americas through Africa into Asia. You remember that sun never sets on the British Empire, that kind of talk. Okay, so the British Empire was in large part a trade empire, a trading empire, And one of its conflicts with the Qing Empire in China was it didn't think the Qing Empire was allowing the British merchants and the British capitalists and the British bankers free enough access to the Chinese market. Because back then, as it is now, the Chinese national economy was one of the largest economies in the world, okay, and the British wanted access to it. Qing were very reluctant to allow access because they knew one of the things that the British were selling in China was opium. Opium, by the way, which they were growing in India. And so for the Chinese government, it was a pretty straightforward no. You don't have anything that Chinese market actually wants besides opium, and you're acting like a bunch of drug dealers. So they wanted to have closed borders around their economy. And of course, the British were very upset about this. So it's not quite technically true that it was the cheap prices of commodities, if we're talking about opium, that was the heavy artillery which battered down these so-called Chinese walls, because the British then fought a series of wars, which they won pretty handily, pretty quickly, in part due to just vastly superior military technology. These were called the Opium Wars. And yes, then they got their free trade. Then they got access to Chinese market. Okay, so, but the point here is, look, the British are going to try and get free trade and extend their commercial empire as far as it'll go. And they're not doing it because they like calling people barbarians and savages and so forth. That's only part of it. The main reason Marx and Engels are saying is economic. The main driver of British empire is capitalism. Okay, because once again, this is a capitalist theory of globalization. Okay, and then Marx and Engels round out this paragraph with this statement. The bourgeoisie compels all nations on pain of extinction to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. So this is a very interesting turn of phrase. Marx and Engels are basically saying, in a capitalist world order, if you don't become part of the system, your very survival as a country is at risk. You may be competed, so to speak, out of the competition between nation states. It compels these other non-capitalist nations to introduce what it calls civilization into its midst. The bourgeoisie compels these non-capitalist nations to become bourgeois themselves. Okay, and so you can think here, for example, in the late 19th century, how when the Americans got to Japan and they wanted to do trade with Japan, just like the British wanted to do trade in China, you can think about how those naval ships, because at the end of the 19th century, the Europeans and the North Americans already had these iron ships, these Ironsides. Okay, and these were quite intimidating things. Okay, and you can imagine reform-minded Japanese. This is especially true in what they call the Meiji period, Meiji, if you want to look this up. They took one look at those ships and they said, we are behind. We are technologically and economically behind. We need to industrialize fast, or these Westerners, these Western, quote, barbarians, are going to take us over and turn us into a colony. And so it was a struggle for sheer national survival in a lot of cases. And this is where Marx and Engels wrap up the paragraph with one of their more famous lines from the Manifesto. The bourgeoisie, in a word, creates a world after its own image. So let's be very clear about what this theory of capitalist globalization is. Marx and Engels are always distinguishing between two levels. There's the economic level. This is the level of political economy. You can also call it the economic base. And then you can build on top of that base, the economic base, you can build what Marx and Engels call political structures or cultural values or cultural practices. Okay, but the main thing is economics. Why do I say this? Because globalization is only standardization at the economic level. The idea is the production techniques that are invented in capitalist countries in the 19th century, Marx and Engels' time, those would have been European and American. Those production techniques will then spread all over the world. So it's not like all the other differences, national differences, religious differences, cultural differences in general, things that are at the ideological level, the cultural level, those things are not going to become standardized. So you can have, according to this theory of globalization, you can have one world market, one world capitalism, and then all sorts of differences and variations between languages, religions, different foods, different ways of dressing, and so forth. Okay, so globalization is standardization in some respects, but it can also be diversity and hybridity in other respects. So a good example here is McDonald's. Every McDonald's all over the world uses assembly line techniques to make whatever the hell they're making. So one of the big innovations of McDonald's, one of the things that allowed McDonald's to get a competitive edge over the other mom and pop burger joints to become one of the biggest multinational corporations in the world was the founders of McDonald's just thought to themselves, wouldn't it be awesome if we could apply these car making assembly line techniques, because this, as I mentioned in one of the previous lectures, this is where the assembly line was invented, to the making of burgers and fries. And that's exactly what they did to great success, because it allowed them to drive the prices down and pay for less labor and so on. Okay, so those assembly line techniques are going to be in McDonald's all over the world, and indeed you've got McDonald's all over the world, but do you also notice you have to adapt to local markets? So there's McCurry Pan, and that's from India. Okay, so McNernberger, Germany. Apricot Sundae, Turkey, and so on. Okay, so, shoot. Okay, so you can have plenty of cultural diversity. It's not like global capitalist globalization makes all cultures the same.